possible. But the challenge for us is to figure out how to hit that spot, creating faculty positions within our writing programs that provide security and fair compensation, and that really demonstrate that we value within our departments and our programs what our writing faculty do. Because ultimately, that's the bottom line. If we continue in the direction that we're headed, we are saying we do not value what writing faculty do. And I know I'm not saying anything new when I say that. Many others have made that argument far more eloquently than I am now. But by looking for where these different areas can converge, I think we can really start to make some differences. So let me just talk about these three different realms in a little bit more detail. I'm going to start with external standards, and I'm not trying to hierarchically order these in any way. I don't think that that's more important. It's simply because I'm not particularly good at manipulating PowerPoint, so it's up on the top. But external standards is a place that we can start, and it directly addresses some of the problematic history that I was talking about at the beginning. So by revisiting the standards of our professional organizations, rewarding deliberately, carefully, thinking about what it is that we're rewarding and holding up as exemplary in our profession, I think we can make a difference. Some things that we can do within our professional organizations to do that. I think starting out by clarifying terms. Not every position can be lumped under contingent faculty. I think, as I said before, non-tenure track faculty is problematic simply because of what it signifies. On our campus until a few years ago, our non-tenure track faculty, this is horrid, they were called special faculty. That was the title, special faculty. What the hell does that mean? And I was blown away that that was the title that we actually used to describe an entire group of faculty. It mainly was related to where the revenue line came from. It was not permanent revenue that was used to hire these positions, which hence the one-year contracts. So we were using soft money to hire people every year, so they had to be called special faculty because we're hiring them, I guess, under special circumstances. But that special circumstance strangely seems to reappear every single year. It never goes away. But clarifying these terms is a place where we can start. We can't lump them all under the same umbrella. Quality of life and inclusion in a scholarly community can be vastly different from one campus to another, depending on how these positions are defined and what the working conditions are. So we need to clarify what our priorities are. What kinds of NTT positions are we as a scholarly community willing to advocate for and step behind? This also needs to be a research and advocacy priority. This is the sort of thing that writing program administrators, such as myself, should be making one of their #1 advocacy priorities. We need to clarify what our criteria are for awards and consider questions like, what happens when a program who has won an award then changes the practices that got them there in the first place? That would have been the case for us when we went back on our extended contracts. That was one of the things in the award letter that we got that we were lauded for. And then, I think it was literally the next year that was yanked from us. So what happens then? Maybe an asterisk in the, I don't know, I have no idea, I don't know. But something that we have to consider. And then I think we can also, within our professional organizations, follow the lead of other organizations that have really taken bold positions through the recommendations made by organizations like the MLA Committee on Contingent Labor in the profession. And we can look to what some of these groups have been doing and model what we're doing in our organizations like 4Cs and WPA after that. So a second part of the equation then is institutional support. And depending on where you are, sometimes this is easier or harder to argue for. But at the institutional level, I think we can rethink how we tenure, what we reward, both monetarily and then also in the things like security and extended contracts. Why can't we tenure teaching track positions? Why not? I don't see why that would be such an issue. We do say, even at research ones like NC State, that we value teaching highly. And the teaching component of my portfolio when I went up for tenure was a very big part of the equation. So if we value teaching so much, why can't we tenure people for that? Consider things like extended and rolling contracts. The rolling contract system that we had at State for a while for our senior lecturers was one that provided total job security for them. Their contract never expired. And under law in North Carolina, they could not be let go as long as they still had time left on their contract. We couldn't just say, oh, there are extenuating circumstances, we're just going to rip your contract up. And that is illegal. So as long as their contract was still in place and there was an additional year left on it, they had protection. So we always had that available. And at the very least, if something had completely changed and we needed to not renew contracts, everyone would have had at least a year where they knew that. Or if there were problems with teaching that would have mandated that we needed to not renew somebody's contract, they have a year to look for something else as well. It's not sudden and immediate like that. Of course, we need to argue for equitable pay and also for support for professional activities. Just because somebody is in a teaching-focused position doesn't mean that they don't need to participate in professional development like this, or going to 4Cs or WPA. Make that kind of travel support contingent, not just on presenting at a conference, but on realizing that being part of a scholarly community and hearing those conversations impacts what we do in the classroom. And that's vitally important. And also, I think at the institutional level, we need to understand that pay is very important, but it is not the only thing. You can have positions with wonderful pay, but that are lacking in other areas, and that came up during our workshop this morning with Nicole. Benefits and other things that contribute to quality of life are incredibly important, and also inclusion within the life of the department and in decision-making that's going on with curriculum that those non-tenure track faculty are often primarily responsible for teaching. At NC State, we use something that's called a statement of mutual expectations, which sounds like it's kind of a fancy term for something that's actually very simple. It's a contract that we have. Every faculty member has one, tenure track and non-tenure track. And it's basically a 1 to 2 page statement that outlines your percentage of responsibilities in different areas. So and we renew it each year. So it changes, it acknowledges that our professional lives are somewhat fluid. Things change. Our job responsibilities might change. Our lives sometimes change. Our interests change. So with my current one, I have a certain percentage that's devoted to administration and then to research and to teaching and to service. And within that, I outline what that looks like. So my participation in research means that I'm going to be doing these different kinds of activities. I list, for example, the kinds of journals that I'm interested in publishing in, or the areas of scholarship that I'm going to be pursuing. My teaching responsibilities are listed. What kinds of courses am I responsible for? What curriculum development am I responsible for? And it's a mutually agreed upon contract, really, that then is signed by the faculty member and the department head. And that statement of mutual expectations is at the front of everybody's dossier when they come up for tenure or for promotion, or for a non-tenure track faculty when they come up for contract renewal. That's the first thing that you look at. Now, we don't allow people to change what the requirements would be for tenure based on that entirely. So if I wanted to say, okay, I'm a tenure track faculty member, I'm going to be 90% teaching, 5% service, and 5% research. And I'll publish maybe 1 article in the next 6 years. I wouldn't get tenure at NC State. So there are parameters that we have to work within that are at the university and system level in UNC. But still, the idea of that, of negotiating a contract between you and a department chair or a program director about what your responsibilities would be, I think is an avenue that we could look at as a possibility. And then finally, and I think maybe sometimes most importantly, is thinking about internal community within a department and within a program. Sometimes it's almost intangible, but there are things that we can do, especially I think if you're in an administrative role, but also faculty within a program can do to really make it more of a community, to make people feel valued and part of the conversation. There are little things we can do. For example, I changed our hiring practices in our program so that no longer do I hire all of the non-tenure track faculty, but we have a small hiring committee, and it's me and my 2 associate directors, one of whom is non-tenure track. When we hired a new associate director for the program, I argued that we had to have a non-tenure track faculty member on the hiring committee and a graduate student, because what that person was doing was going to greatly affect their lives. And it was important to have those perspectives as we were thinking about who we wanted to hire, even though it was a tenure track position. So there are things like that that I think administrators and faculty can do to advocate for inclusion within a program that really can help develop community. So much, I think, can happen within a program when all faculty are treated as part of a scholarly community and as having a voice. Nancy Penrose describes in a recent article that she published in WPA some of the interesting distinctions that can be made within professional development. And if this is something that you're interested in, developing that kind of community, I really urge you to take a look at that piece. I don't have a really easy answer. Non-tenure track positions are such a huge part of our shared reality in writing programs, but we certainly need a more robust understanding of what these positions look like and what they should look like. We need to hear the voices of faculty who are in those positions. So I also advocate, I'll continue to extend this research, but just hearing perspectives about how do these positions actually work. They might look good on paper, but what is the reality? What things are working well, and what could we tweak to make them work better? And as a profession, we really need to decide, what do we want to advocate for? What are our goals for the future? I think with a shared vision that brings together these three areas, we really can create a better future for writing faculty in general. Thank you.
And since we have this room, we can actually stay here a little longer for Q&A and maybe push back the next workshop session. So open up the floor to Q&A, and if you ask questions, you get to use this microphone.
As an added incentive.
And you are allowed to do your Madonna impression if you get this in your hand.
And you can go back to eating your chips and stuff now too if you want, if Mark cuts you off.
I'm just curious about the use of the word salary for contingent faculty. My understanding is I'm earning a wage.
That's a great point, and frankly, it's a distinction I hadn't really thought about, but an important one, I think. There are certainly different connotations about different labor connotations that come up with those two different terms. So is that a term in your institutional context? That is how it's described? You have like an hourly wage? Okay. So is that term used equally for non-tenure track or for contingent faculty, for full-time, part-time?
I don't know.
Tenured, okay. To me, that would be a really interesting distinction to look at.
My reason for always reacting to the term when I see it, even in a much wider context than this, is I'm thinking of the dictionary definition of salary versus the dictionary definition of wage.
Yeah.
I'm paid by the hour times by the course. If I had a salary, it would be by the week or by the month or by the year.
Right, right. No, I think that's such an important distinction. I'm going to make a note to myself because I think that's really important.
I would add to that,
Mark.
Being at CUNY, we actually have wage and salary, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but you have a wage, and that's based upon what kind of terminal degree you have, and then that's what decides your salary.
Right.
So there's actually a relationship between those two terms.
That makes sense. And in a lot of institutions, I don't know if CUNY is like this. I know the community college I was at was, and salaries it's very transparent. There was a salary scale that we were on based on our level of degree, our years of teaching experience, and boom, it was sort of like many public school systems. You fell on that scale at some point, and that was an hourly wage that you were earning, but then that was how they figured your salary, which it sounds like what you're describing. There is sort of a larger connotation, though, of salaried positions versus wage positions that implies work that you're doing that you're not necessarily clocking in for, or you're on the clock or off the clock. So there is sort of a sense that as academics and professionals in a scholarly community, we're sort of this is sort of our life. It's sort of a life of the mind. Although there are some ideas about that I think can be kind of old-fashioned too. I mean, I also want to have a life outside of what I do at school. So, but thank you, really helpful.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to kind of discuss with you the gray area that is graduate students. At my institution. They call us teaching fellows, where, and I was remarking to my colleagues that the salaries that you named as a non-tenure track professor getting per class, we earn that in a semester. So it comes as a stipend, and then the replacement, I guess, of the rest of that is tuition credits. So I was just kind of wondering what your institution is kind of doing to, and then there's no discussion of what would happen, like if they wanted to hire a graduate student to become tenure track or even to stay on the position. It's just, you get it, you don't, you don't.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I didn't directly talk about graduate student labor here, although, heavens, that is a big area we could also talk about. And certainly a huge part of the equation, both in terms of how it contributes to the working conditions within our programs and the growth of the non-tenure track faculty ranks. At my particular institution, our graduate students at the doctoral level are actually paid more than our non-tenure track faculty are paid per class. At the master's level, they're paid less. But either way, the pay is ridiculously low. And nobody should be paid that and expected to live on it. And our PhD students, Katie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you were one of ours, but our PhD students, I think, are expected to not work outside of the institution or program. So they are somehow expected to magically figure out how to make the stipend, and it's, now I can't remember what it is, 15? It's like around 15,000 a year. They're expected to somehow figure out how to live on that. And it's a very important part of the equation too, and there are certainly plenty of examples of institutions where graduate students are paid even less than part-time. And another factor that I did not bring up is at many institutions, part-time faculty are paid a salary that is less per class than what the full-time counterpart would be paid. That happened at the community college that I was at. So we had one sort of salary scale that applied to our part-time faculty, and then another that applied to our full-time. At the institution where I am now, we pay people who choose to be part-time a wage that it's prorated. Now I'm really self-conscious about whether I'm saying wage or salary. But we pay them something that is prorated based on what their full-time salary would be, so that it's equivalent regardless of whether they choose to teach one class or 3. Our full-time load is 3. But is it called what? I don't know. Parenting? Parity. Oh, parity. I don't know. Well, I guess, just like salary to make it. Okay.
The same amount as if I were teaching full-time faculty, assuming my
Yes. Yeah. So that there's not a huge differential between what's being paid. So.
Hi. My question is about research and research expectations. I've been on both sides of this fence. I was in a non-tenure track job for a number of years, and I even became the WPA there in a program where there were no tenure track faculty at all. And now I'm in a tenure track position, but we also have lecturers. And the thing that I noticed was that at the former institution, there was really, the institution was not very interested in comp research, and B, that made the, I was like the only one who was, really, and it was very difficult to get collaborative projects going. But I find that now, I mean, we do have a community of tenure track people who are doing research, but that seemed, the lecturers seem more interested in participating in collaborative projects because of that. So I guess my question is, how does the whole question of research and the valuing of research fit into this whole equation?
That's a great question. And especially at institutions where research is really valued, that's something that we have to think about too when we're arguing for changes in working conditions. I've actually found some of my best collaborators to be the lecturers and graduate students in our program. I usually co-author with them. But we also have to be careful about what we expect of faculty who don't have research as part of their contract. And if you're already teaching a 100% load of courses, then are you just expected to do additional research kind of on the side? And it can be a little bit of a slippery slope, because sometimes we use things like publications and conference presentations as ways to point to how our non-tenure track faculty are doing really excellent work. Look at the things that they're producing and the way that they're being involved in the professional community, but then that ends up setting up an expectation that can sometimes be unfair. One of the things that we experimented with at NC State was starting a grant program that our non-tenure track faculty were eligible to apply for. And it was just within our department. And they were small research grants. I think they were for up to $2,000. And it was salary, additional salary over the summer. And you could apply to do a project that, sort of like what I was describing for the sabbaticals at the community college, something that was related to your teaching, something that would help invigorate what you're doing in the classroom. It didn't necessarily have to be a research project, though, that somehow would lead to a conference presentation or a publication. You just had to be able to demonstrate, here's how this work that I did is influencing what I'm doing in the classroom. So some people took additional workshops in using technology in the classroom. Someone went and took a graduate class and something that he was interested in. And then some people did more kind of traditional looking research projects. But remembering that if we want to incorporate the scholarship of teaching and learning in some way into the equation here, we have to figure out a way to reward that too, and think about things like merit raises for doing things like that. But we don't always have the kind of flexibility budget-wise that would allow for that. Yeah, Brian.
Hi, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what roles you believe unions could or should play in this conversation.
That's a great question, Brian, and it's one that I am woefully inadequate to answer. I have never actually worked in an institution that was in a state where we had teaching unions. So North Carolina is a right-to-work state. We don't have unions. It would, I think, help our non-tenure track faculty tremendously in terms of, like, if you think about the things I was describing as problematic working conditions in North Carolina, those are exactly the kinds of things that a union could help us to argue for extended contracts, for better salary. There are some things that are less tangible, I think, within departmental life that are harder for unions to really assist with. But I don't know, does anyone else have comments that they want to make about that? Yeah?
We have a teachers union,
Mm-hmm.
and the adjunct faculty are in the teachers union.
Mm-hmm.
They have representatives, but the tendency is that things go in the favor of the full-time tenure track faculty, and the adjuncts get the leftovers. And so they're not truly being supported in terms of the work that's being done and the needs that adjunct faculty has. So yes, it's good that there's some degree of representation, but it's also how it's being used. And so full-time faculty decides to go on strike. Adjuncts are dragged along. They're not necessarily in agreement with all the issues that are on the table. So it's got some really complicated dimensions to it. It's not a simple, let's have a union and everybody's going to be happy.
Sure, sure. And I think you see some of those same kinds of issues just in shared governance situations in schools across the country. So an example that I would give is at one institution that I worked at, only tenure track faculty were allowed to serve on the faculty senate. And that was the body within the institution that advocated most strongly for things related to working conditions. At NC State, non-tenure track faculty can serve on the faculty senate, but most of them don't know that they can, and no one really tells them that they can. So there are some shared concerns, I think, there.
They just made that change.
Okay. That's wonderful. And I found it increasingly problematic when I was serving on the faculty senate. Every time an issue came up related to non-tenure track faculty, someone would bring the document to me and say, well, you should read this, because I guess I was somehow the expert because I directed a program with non-tenure track faculty. And I kept telling them, I'm not who you need to be asking. You need to be showing this personnel document to the people that it is going to affect most. And those are the people you need to have serving on this committee and talking about how we're defining non-tenure track faculty roles in the institution. So advocating for that voice, I think, in those discussions is really important. Yeah. Oh.
In my experience, writing program administrators are incredibly supportive and always working to advocate for the higher level administrators to make changes in this. But I find when I'm talking to professionals in other fields, they are incredibly ignorant about this and absolutely shocked about our salaries and our working conditions. And I'm wondering if you think what other constituencies outside of our own really supportive communities might have a role to play in influencing these higher level administrators?
That's a good question, too. On my campus, I have found the Faculty Senate to be a wonderful place to advocate for those kinds of things within the institutional context. So once I realized, for example, that non-tenure track faculty were allowed to serve, I recruit people to be on Faculty Senate. So I want to always make sure there is someone who's on there that is a non-tenure track faculty member who will continue to bring forward that position. And it takes somebody who doesn't really mind kind of sticking their neck out and saying, okay, well, you're forgetting this particular position. But usually if I'm also on Faculty Senate, or right now my colleague Nancy Penrose, who directed the program before me, is on there, then we can also sort of chime in and advocate for that. But what I found is every time we'll bring up questions about things like salary and working conditions within our program, other people across the university are shocked. Seriously? You guys pay that to your adjunct faculty? And of course, there are a lot of different things that are involved in determining budgets and how much you can pay. But sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out the avenues, I think, to get the word out, to advocate, and to make sure that people understand what the particular issues are within your program. There's a balance there, too, because I also want to be careful that it doesn't sound like I'm always kind of the Debbie Downer saying all of the terrible things going on in the writing program. So we also put a lot of effort into things like the National Day on Writing so that we can showcase some of the really good things that are coming out of our program too. Linda.
So if you were to recommend the sort of essential things for people to investigate, if they wanted to make some changes, what would you say were the sort of really key things people should look into?
Well, I think one of the first things to figure out is to determine what specifically the working conditions are on your campus and what you want to advocate for. Because of course that differs from one campus to the next. So a couple of the things that I have found most helpful are first to network with other people on campus that are also concerned about those same issues. And it may seem like that they're not out there, but often they are. I've found wonderful partners in my vice provost for personnel, who was aware of things going on in other departments, but not entirely aware of what was going on within English. And also with other non-tenure track faculty in the other departments around campus. So networking with those people and learning what they do in their departments. Some departments at NC State are incredibly good at incorporating their non-tenure track faculty in the life of the department, and it just takes my saying at an English department faculty meeting, hey, did you know over in chemistry that they do this? To sort of have the light bulb turn on. So networking, I think, and learning what's going on within the institution. If you're not familiar with organizations like the New Faculty Majority, with the work that the MLA has been doing and the recommendations that they've made, first go to Nicole's workshop next, because she has a lot of that information. But look at this information online, the new faculty majority, the adjunct project, because then you can compare what's going on in different institutions. And then an organization like this, like Metro WPA, is an ideal environment for you to get a sense of what's going on at different institutions that are your peer institutions or that are within the same system that you work in, so that you can figure out, again, how to advocate for the kinds of change that you want. Are there other things that you all would recommend that you have found particularly helpful? Yeah, Risa.
Make sure you're tenured before you start advocating for people in your program who aren't.
Yeah.
If you're on a tenure line as a WPA, or if you're the only writing person in an English department on a tenure line, and you're advocating for the people who are non-tenured in your department, that can be really dangerous.
Yes, that's a really good advice.
There are a lot of people who have lost their jobs.
Yeah, you have to be careful about that. What I have found when I was in a more vulnerable position is that often, instead of being as sort of in-your-face vocal as I can be about it now, instead I would point to standards that our professional organizations published. I can't tell you how many times since the recommendations from MLA came out only 2 years ago, I can't tell you how many times I have put them on the desk of my department head and dean and highlighted things. I can do that a little more in your face now than I could before, but sometimes it would just take an email saying to my department head, he is an English person, hey, are you aware of this document that the MLA published? And then I wouldn't even say anything else about it, but just, you might want to take a look at this, because this is actually your home organization. Have you read this? It's really interesting. But yes, you have to be careful thinking about sort of your subject position within an institution.
I was going to add to that as well, because it seems to me that a really good thing that we've always tried to do is make sure that you put the dream policy that you have on paper. Yes. And you write it and you give that document to your provost, whoever's going to make the decision, because every time we've done that, the person goes, oh, they made the effort, they flirted with logic, they looked at all the possibilities. And we sometimes got more than we wanted to.
Right.
Again, we're writers and writing teachers, and I think sometimes we forget to use the power of...
the power of rhetoric.
Right.
Absolutely. And I want to add one thing to that too, Mark. Anytime that you're going to advocate for something that will cost money, and a lot of these things do, so one of the things I wanted to advocate for were smaller class sizes, a common one in many writing programs. Do your homework and figure out how much it costs. So if you're going to be advocating, instead of just going to a department chair and saying, okay, well, our course caps should be 20, because that's what 4C says, or they should be 15 in our basic writing classes, because that's what 4C says. Sit down and do your homework, figure out how much it would cost, or at least estimate across your department. I know, do math. Actually, Chris Anson wrote a fantastic article about this, and I wish I could remember which book it was in. Do you know, Linda, by any chance? One of the WPA books. But he just talks about knowing how budgets work. The Longman book on writing program administration.
I have it downstairs. I can get it later.
Okay. So just understanding a little bit about the budget and then trying to brainstorm ways that you would actually come up with that money. So, for example, when I wanted to change our course caps, I came up with this grand scheme that I knew we had a problem with the way we were placing students too. So I thought, well, if we could implement directed self-placement, I would estimate that the number of basic writing classes that we're offering would probably shift by this much, because we were placing students in basic writing, and this was just our institution, but a lot of students were in there who really didn't need to be there. We were putting them there just based on SAT scores and looking at nothing else. So our number of students in these classes would probably change by about this much. It would generate X amount of revenue, and here's how I would pay for our course cap reduction. Now, what ended up happening is after I figured that out, we had a budget crisis, and the dean came to us and said, okay, you need to cut X number of sections of first year writing and let this number of faculty go. And I said, wait, wait, I have a plan. Here's what we could do. Let's implement directed self-placement instead, and we can just rearrange what's going on. Because, of course, when you start cutting sections, you have two problems. Not only are you letting faculty go, but then students can't graduate because they're not taking the classes that they need, and you end up with this backlog of classes. So anyhow, long story short, know how budgets work.
Different categories equitable.
Right.
Like service is such a vague thing, and so I was just wondering if you knew anything about that.
This is one of the reasons that I really advocate for something like what I had described as the statement of mutual expectations, so that you can define, and granted I'm saying 10% of my time is service. And what does that mean? And how many hours is that per week? At one point I actually tried to quantify it and say, okay, well if I'm 50% administration, then I'm only going to be in my office doing administrative work 20 hours a week. And I'm going to clock it. And that never happens. It was a nice effort. But one of the things that we've started to recognize is that when we have those statements of mutual expectations, if we're requiring our senior lecturers, for example, to do X amount of service, they help us mentor our teaching assistants, they do classroom observations, then really I'm asking them to do 110% work, because their teaching load wasn't reduced for that. So I've been starting to argue to my department head that what we need to do is to give a course release to senior lecturers, like one course release every 3 years, at least, for just to compensate for the amount that we're asking them to do by doing things like classroom observations, or helping to mentor a TA, or pay them for that work. So when we have non-tenure track faculty who mentor our teaching assistants, they shadow them for a semester before they teach in the classroom. We pay them a stipend to do that, because it's work to mentor someone. That shouldn't just be on top of what you're doing. Now, granted, all of this is dependent on a benevolent department chair or person in charge of the budget who understands and advocates for these things as well. But I think there are things we can do to make sure that we're not then just lumping more and more service on top of people who already are undercompensated for the work that they're doing.
I think we have time for probably 2 more questions.
That's fine.
If you have the energy for 2 more questions.
Whatever you say, Mark, I will do.
Now that's what I want to hear. 24/7.
This is a little out of sequence now, but it pertains to what we were just talking about. It's not so much a question, it's just to corroborate something you were saying, Susan. And it's a bit of a plug too. Mark and I are doing the framework workshop, and one of the habits of mine is persistence. And I want to encourage people to remember to be persistent in their advocacy. I'll tell you a story. It's a happy story. Where I am at Stony Brook, 12 years ago, we took a 10-year plan, and we asked the faculty what their concerns are, and to be expected, they were better job security and better salary. So I initiated a campaign to institute a senior lectureship. Most of our faculty are on lecturer lines. And we infiltrated the faculty senate. 2 of us got in. 1 of us became president of the faculty senate. And I'm happy to say within 10 years, we got a senior lectureship position. And we have our first cohort just this past year with improved salary. It's not great, but it's a bit of a hike, and improved job security. So stick to it. It took us a long time. But we did it, and one of the main ways that we made this happen was by making comparisons with not only nearby schools that we framed them as competitors, but also Stony Brook is very proud of being AAU, so we looked up the AAU institutions and said, hey, if you want to be in this club, you've got to be truly in the club, so let's try to establish some equity. So hang in there.
That's great. Looking to peer institutions can be so helpful, too. So it can sometimes backfire if they don't do things the way that you want them to, but yeah, that's great.
It sounds like infiltration was important there, too.
Yes. Infiltrate.
And between the lines, subversion.
Yeah. I want to, while we're going to the next question, I just wanted to add one other idea to sort of plant in your head as something, kind of going back to Linda's question about what kinds of steps could you take. And I know we're all in different positions in the programs that we teach in, and so you may or may not be in a position to make this sort of thing happen, but a lot of us are in programs where we have kind of back to school meetings, or you'll have some sort of professional development at the beginning of the year, maybe you bring in a speaker, or you do something to kind of get things kick-started. The very first year that I directed our program at State, I couldn't really figure out what to do because I was still kind of new there. Like, well, what speaker do I bring in? What do they need to hear? They certainly don't want to listen to me. So So instead what I did is I brought in a bunch of giant Post-it pads, and we worked in small groups all morning, and I just gave them a series of different prompts to get them to talk about what kinds of things we were doing well in our program, because they all had been there longer than me. What are we doing really well, and what are the things that we really need to change? And I had heuristics that were related to our curriculum, related to working conditions, related to what we're doing within the institution and how we're connecting with other departments on campus. And it ended up giving me, as the director, a list of things that I should prioritize based on what the faculty in our program really were perceiving needed to change, and what things we should prioritize as strengths within the program. So something like that can be a wonderful generative session, and then it also ends up contributing to helping the faculty in your program know that their opinion is valued. And if that's what you end up using as the agenda for what you're doing in your program. So, one more? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can expand on your thinking about the whole rhetoric of financial uncertainty, and that we need the flexibility argument, and how prevalent you think it is, or how you think it works, or how much it runs up against reality, or how much writing programs ever really fall into that category, because like you said,
yeah,
they need us anyway.
Yep. That's a good question. And I have to start with the caveat that I have never been a department head or a dean, so I have never necessarily had to manage my own budget where someone came to me and said, okay, you need to carve out $60,000 worth of your budget now. Figure out how to do it. That happens to my department head a lot, though, and I usually end up having to talk with him about how we're going to address it. So it is a reality. Especially in public institutions where we rely on, to a greater or lesser degree, the benevolence of state legislatures. And if you're familiar at all with North Carolina, ours is not particularly benevolent towards education right now, nor is our governor, who's had a lot to say lately about the liberal arts. So it is certainly a reality and something that we have to think about. But I always advocate within our department to not have a reactive response to those kinds of things. Instead, I'm always saying when things are really good, then that's the time when we should be sitting down and figuring out, and this sounds again like Debbie Downer, if something changes, how are the ways that we could generate money? What is it that we would do? How can we think creatively about how to address an issue instead of immediately saying, okay, we're going to have to start letting faculty go? Because it's not just that you're letting faculty go. I mean, but that's a big deal. And these are people's lives. This is their livelihood. But it also ends up impacting students tremendously. Whether it's that you just end up canceling sections and they can't get the courses that they need, or you increase class size, and so then they're not getting the individual attention that they need. Thinking creatively and trying to come up with other sorts of solutions that meet both of those needs, I think, is incredibly important. But we can't ignore it. I think often as WPAs, because we don't have access to our own budget and we're not in charge of it, it's easy for us to ignore the math and to just say, oh, well, I don't have to balance that, so it doesn't really pertain to me. But it does. And we need to be as aware as possible of where the money is coming from that funds different kinds of things within our program, how much is needed in order to continue to make those work in the way we want them to, where are the places within an institution that money can be generated in ways that we haven't thought about before. And every school is different. I found out when I came to state that our distance learning classes were funded entirely separately. It's a model that I have a lot of problems with. Actually, they pay per student in your class, which is an abysmal practice, I think, for distance learning writing. If you want to have small enough class sizes to make it work, that's another issue. But one of the things that our department had started doing with some of our classes, where it didn't maybe matter as much if the class sizes were larger than 15 or 20, was to start moving a couple of our classes online, because the department was then paid for those classes instead of having to come up with the money out of their budget. That may or may not have been a good choice, but it was a way that we were trying to think about, well, how can we sort of work through some of the budget issues that we're having to deal with in ways that might be more creative than just cutting stuff. So, all right.
I just wanted to say thank you, and I don't find this Debbie Downer because even though, because you've always pointed at the lack of wealth that we may have monetarily, but I think what Susan has brought to the forefront is we have a wealth of creativity and a whole lot of other energies that we can call upon to try to resolve these problems that we can't solve with money. And I think it's a testament really to the kind of work and research that Susan does that gives us faith and hope. So not Debbie Downer, but yay. Can we have a round of applause?